There I was in a deep, dark pit, thrown there by my jealous brothers. And I was scared to death. There was no way out of there, nothing to climb out with. And I could hear them casually chatting over their lunch. And none of the talk was about getting me out once I'd learned my lesson. I mean, I was just a kid. And I knew they hated me, but I never saw this coming. I mean, all brothers fight, don't they? And there was more rivalry in our family than most. But why would anyone want me dead? Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Joseph. I'm son of Jacob. He's sometimes called Israel, but mostly Jacob. And you might have heard of me and my amazing Technicolor dream coat. But I come from way back. My great-grandfather was Abraham. My grandfather was Isaac, and my father was Jacob. And we were a family that had a promise. A promise that God had made to us. A promise of a land of our own, that our descendants would be as numerous as the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. But we lived in a time of change and upheaval. And to be honest, there weren't that many of us, and that promise seemed a long way off. We were just shepherds and herdsmen. We were always on the lookout for more pasture. And I had 10 older brothers, and they didn't care for me too much. But was I bothered? No, I was more bothered by the fact that an Apple thing has just come up on my screen for no reason. I considered myself way smarter than they were. And that's exactly what got me into trouble. They were jealous of me. In fact, they actually despised me. And my only sort of friend, if you could call him that, amongst my brothers was Reuben. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here today. He looked out for me as much as he could, more out of loyalty to my dad than to me. Ah, yes. Looking back, my dad didn't really help matters. He favoured me way above them. And everybody knew it. I knew it. They knew it. The servants knew it. And looking back, I could see how that was a cause of some tension in our family. And I wouldn't recommend Jacob's technique as a parenting class. But I'm sure none of you would make that mistake. But one day he gave me this stunning jacket to wear. And I loved it. And I wore it proudly. But it was causing deep resentment amongst my brothers. It was a way of flaunting. Dad likes me more than you do. Than he likes you. And then one day I went too far. You see, I'd had this dream. It was a dream that for some time it would become something of a nightmare. My dream described my brothers having to serve me and bowing at my feet. And maybe not really that surprised that they were beside themselves with anger, and rage just overtook them. That was when they decided enough was enough. I had to go. And one day, as they were out feeding the flocks in Shechem, my dad sent me out to check on them. You see, I should tell you, I was a bit of a squealer as well. When my brothers weren't really pulling their weight, I would go and report them. And they seized me. And some of them wanted to murder me right there and then. But Reuben came to my defense. He convinced them, why don't we just throw him into that pit? Which, I admit it, when you kind of just put it bluntly like that, it didn't sound that much better than just kill him. But he did intend to return later and release me. And so there I was, at the bottom of the pit, wondering what was next. Ever been in a position like that? No way out. Scary, isn't it? But then Reuben had chores to attend to. And whilst he was away, a caravan of Midianites or Ishmaelites came by. They were heading for Egypt. And with Reuben not around to defend me, my brothers sold me as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. I was terrified. I was 17. My life was turned upside down. And all I had was my God and my dream. I remember that journey, thinking I'd never see my father again. I'd never sleep in my own bed again. And who knew what awaited me in Egypt? Yeah, the only things I had were God and my dream. But my father had told me how God had proven himself faithful to our family many times, going way back to my great-grandfather Abraham. And I knew he was still with me, even though it seemed strange that he was allowing this to happen. And I can't say I didn't struggle with anger towards my brothers. It was hard to forgive them. But I knew enough about God to know eventually I was going to have to. And over time, God helped me overcome it all. But that happened in Egypt. Don't know if you've ever moved to a foreign country. If you have, you'll know something that I was about to experience as a 17-year-old. Egypt was full of new experiences. It was a new language, new culture, new religions, new foods. And actually, given that I was a slave, which is a pretty low position, things actually went quite well for a while. When I was placed on the slave auction, which I have to say is the most humiliating experience you can imagine, I was purchased by a man with power and means. His name was Potiphar. He was a captain in Pharaoh's army. And I worked hard. I served him as if I was serving God. And then, with God's blessing, I caught his eye and I soon became overseer of his entire household. I earned his respect and favour, which was quite uncommon, really, in those days. But then, just as things were going smoothly and really starting to look up, it all went pear-shaped again. My master's wife tried to seduce me. I refused her, but she wouldn't stop. Again and again, every time Potiphar's back was turned, she'd contrive to get me alone and try to talk me into bed. I had another choice to make. Should I allow this temptation to overcome me? Should I think, well, she is my mistress and I'm nothing but a slave? Or should I overcome it? And I remembered my dreams, God's promises, and my commitment to God. But then, one day, when we were alone, she made a grab for me. And as I ran from her, in the process, my cloak ripped off as she tore it from me. And she kept my garment. and she showed it to Potiphar when he returned from his business trip. And when Potiphar got the news, I was in deep trouble. All the respect and goodwill I'd earned vanished into thin air. Potiphar was furious. Do you know, when I look back, the fact that he had me thrown into jail rather than had me killed on the spot suggests that Potiphar wasn't entirely convinced. But it made little difference. Just as my brothers thought all those years ago, I had to go. And I was sent to jail. No trial, no lawyer, do not pass go, straight to jail. And my life was turned upside down again, and all I had now was my God and my dream. Prisons in ancient Egypt were dreadful places, but yet again there were signs that God was still with me, even there, being faithful to me. I soon gained favour with the guards. I became the warden's right-hand man. And what's more, the prison to which I had been assigned, because of Potiphar's status, was one where the king's prisoners were held. And so I made some contacts which would come in quite handy later. For time passed, and Pharaoh became angry with two of his officers, the baker and the butler. They were thrown into jail too, and because of my position, I was put in charge of them, and it felt strange to be in charge of the king's servants. But then one night they both had dreams, and they were disturbed and perplexed by their dreams. They became sad and depressed. I was kept saying to them, "What's going on? What is it?" And eventually they admitted that they'd had these dreams. Well, I knew a few things about dreams. And I knew that sometimes they could become a nightmare. But I took the risk. I said, "Well, tell me, what are they?" And God had given me an ability to understand and interpret dreams. So by God's grace, I was able to explain their dreams to them. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. And in that case, it was one of each. For one, his dream would be good news. In 3 days, the butler would be released from prison and given his old job back. But as I say, some dreams can be a nightmare. And the baker would soon discover that to his cost. In 3 days, he'd be dead. I remember the day the butler got released. And I remember pleading with him clearly and emphatically, "Remember me when you get out of here." Because this was my best chance to get out of prison. Because without this, I could just rot away and be forgotten forever. And you know, I really thought this guy was going to come through for me. But he didn't. I felt so let down. And I could have become really bitter inside. But God in His grace kept me going. Because I knew that bitterness wasn't the answer. That God would stay with me. And even if I didn't understand what was going on, all I had was my God and my dream. You can wait for ages for anything to happen, and then it all happens at once. And that's what happened to me. See, Pharaoh also had a dream that nobody could interpret. And Pharaoh called in all his magicians and his wise men, but none of them had a clue what he was talking about. And that was when the butler suddenly remembered me, mostly to save his own neck, to be honest. The butler spoke to Pharaoh and said something like, "Hold on a second, I know a chap. I met him in prison. He has this amazing ability to understand things. Maybe he can help us." And immediately Pharaoh said, "Summon him at once." And I was quickly changed into fresh clothes. I had a shave, or at least I trimmed the beard down. I washed myself, and after all, I was appearing before a king. And when Pharaoh related the dream to me, I immediately understood it, and God had given me the interpretation. And I was careful to tell Pharaoh that I'm no magician, that I was a servant of the Most High God, and it was God who was interpreting the dream. And his dream went something like this: for 7 years you're going to have a great harvest. It'll be a bumper crop for 7 consecutive years. You'll have never had it so good. But then there'll be 7 years of hardship and drought, years of famine. And they will destroy you unless we plan and prepare for them. And Pharaoh listened as I spoke. He seemed happy at first, then his mood turned somber as I shared with him what was about to happen. And while Pharaoh didn't know my God, didn't believe in my God, didn't care about him, he believed in what I said. And while the dream was astounding and incredible on a personal level, this was a big break for me. God had opened a way out of prison for me. Sometimes God really surprises me. And just thinking of Pharaoh's dream reminded me of my dream again. My life was still upside down. All I had was my God and my dream, but it was all I really needed. But I wasn't prepared for what came next, because then Pharaoh really shocked me. He appointed me second in command in his kingdom. He took off a signet ring and placed it on my fingers. New fine linen clothes were given to me, a gold chain placed around my neck. And then the biggest of honour of all, I was given a second chariot to ride in. I would go through the streets and with people bowing before me and servants crying out, "Bow the knee! Bow the knee!" Talk about going from rags to riches. I couldn't believe it. I went from being virtually powerless to the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And this at a time when Egypt really was something. And I knew this was God's doing because he had given me the gift of interpreting dreams. I just didn't know why. But I sensed there was more to come. By now I was getting on a bit. I'd reached the grand old age of 30. 13 years had passed since I'd been sold as a slave. Much of that time I spent in prison feeling forgotten. And now, by God's grace, I was promoted to the second ranking official in all Egypt. And Pharaoh even presented me with a beautiful wife, and together we had 2 beautiful sons. We named our first Manasseh and the second Ephraim, and we chose those names because of how God had looked after me in trouble and proved faithful. And I would look into the faces of those 2 precious sons and saw the grace and loving care of God. God sure is filled with surprises. That dream from all those years ago in Shechem was starting to take shape as God showed again and again he was still in control. I remember what had sustained me in early years when my life was turned upside down. All I had was my God and my dream. And now the dream was becoming a reality rather than a nightmare. And in my new responsibilities as second in command, Pharaoh charged me with preparing the entire nation for the 7 bad years to come. During the 7 good years, I gathered and warehoused as much grain as possible. Storage sites had to be built. Workers had to be mobilized. There was a major national campaign to preserve Egypt from famine. I worked long days and long nights, and at the end of a 7-year campaign, we had a survival plan in place. The 7 good years ended, the 7 bad years began. We went from boom to bust. The rain stopped falling, the mighty Nile slowed to a trickle, drought began to set in. And the drought was severe in all of the surrounding lands too, and people from all the nations came to buy grain from me in Egypt. And it took divine wisdom to distribute the grain fairly and justly. But by now I'd learned a few things about justice. I suppose I should have guessed what was going to happen next when I thought about it. But preparing for 7 years didn't get me ready for this. My father sent my 10 older brothers, the hated brothers, to Egypt to buy food. And after all these years, my 10 brothers were standing before me. I recognised them right away. They hadn't changed much. But they didn't recognise me. After all, I was an Egyptian executive now, not some lean, rash Jewish teen. They weren't expecting to see me. And my mind began to work fast. What do? Revenge or mercy? They'd never know it was me. But God would and I would. I had to help them. And I knew what was at stake here. The survival of my people. The survival of God's story. And now it was all beginning to make sense. Amazing. I began to just glimpse for a moment why God had brought me to this place in the first place. But I didn't know how to tell them. I needed to buy time. So to challenge them, I spoke roughly to them. I accused them of being spies, which they denied, of course. So I decided to make it interesting. I set up a test of their truthfulness. Bring this younger brother you speak of, and I'll keep Simeon here until you return. And they already felt guilt over their wicked plot to kill and sell me as a teenager. Now this was happening. Reuben was speaking to them. I could understand him, but they didn't know. He says, didn't I tell you that God would punish us for what we did to Joseph? And of course, I knew their language, even if they didn't know. And I had to turn away and weep. So Simeon stayed as insurance. I filled their sacks with grain, put their money in the sacks and sent them off. And when they returned home without Simeon, now being forced to deliver Benjamin, Jacob, my father, was distraught. Joseph is dead. Simeon's in prison in Egypt, and now you want Benjamin? It was almost too much for my aging father, but Reuben again spoke up. I promise you, I will deliver Benjamin back safely. Jacob said, no deal. You're staying home. And so they did. But the grain came to an end before the famine did. And they needed more food. And they had to go back to Egypt. And this time when they arrived, I invited them to dine with me. And Benjamin was with them. When I saw my beloved younger brother Benjamin, I had to leave the room and weep. It was way too much for me. We ate a meal together for the first time in 13 years. And then I filled their sacks with grain. I planted a cup in Benjamin's sack, and of course our security people discovered the stolen property and arrested them and brought them to me immediately. They were apologetic and baffled. I set their punishment. Benjamin would become my slave, but they protested, no, it'll kill our father. And at this point I could take it no longer. And I revealed my identity to my brothers. Come close to me. I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery. Don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. We've had famine for 2 years. We're going to have it for 5 more. God sent me before you to save your lives by a great deliverance. It wasn't you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout the land of Egypt. Now bring our father here. Say to him, God has made Joseph lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. Dwell in the land of Goshen, and you will be near me, and your children and your flocks and herds and all that you have. Then I will provide for you. Because there's still 5 years of this to go. And then I simply embraced Benjamin, and we wept together. I kissed all my brothers, and we talked together for a long while. And when Pharaoh heard all this, he supplied the carts and the animals to journey to Canaan for Jacob. And he said, the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. As I look back on my life and the dramatic events God has brought me through, I suppose I summarize it all this way. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people. Have you ever heard the expression, it's not how you start, it's how you finish? Well, I've proven that to be true, and God proved himself faithful to me. My dream became reality, although for a while it seemed like one big nightmare that wouldn't go away. But God proved faithful. I've learned to trust him. When my life was turned upside down, all I had was my God and my dream. And this was more than enough. God had a plan, and if we stick with him, his plan won't fail. And when I was a boy, God gave me a dream. It was actually a promise. And God made good on that promise. And I look at my children, I see the power I have in Egypt, I look at my brothers with whom I'm now reconciled, and I look at my father. What a blessing to have a few years with him before he died. And as for my dream, that that one about my family bowing down to me, well, yes, it happened. But I now see it as a privilege to serve them. For in serving them, I really serve my Lord. Grace and peace be with you.